You wake in the middle of the night. Not because of a scream, not because of footsteps, but because the dogs stopped barking. And in ancient Laconia, that meant something. The wind moves through the valley of the Eurotas River. The fields are dark. The mountains of Taganus rise like a black wall against the stars. Somewhere beyond the olive groves and scattered farmhouses, a young Spartan moves silently downhill. He does not wear the red cloak of a hoplite. He carries no shield, no bronze armor, no emblem of glory, only a blade. And orders. This is not Thermopylae. This is not the battlefield of Plataea. This is not the heroic Sparta of legend. This is the Sparta few talk about, the Sparta that ruled through fear. By the 5th century BCE, Sparta was the dominant military power of mainland Greece. Its disciplined hoplite army had defeated rivals, crushed rebellions. But beneath that image of unity and strength lay a demographic reality that shaped everything. The true Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, were few, perhaps only 8,000 at their peak. Maybe fewer. Yet they ruled over a vast population of helots, state-owned serfs primarily from Messenia, conquered generations earlier. These helots farmed the land, harvested grain, tended livestock, and ensured that Spartan men could devote their lives to military training. The ratio may have been as high as 7 helots for every Spartiate. Some ancient writers suggest even more. Now imagine ruling a population that outnumbers you so dramatically. Imagine knowing that if they rose together, your city would fall in days. Sparta did not rely on walls to protect itself. In fact, ancient authors often boasted that Sparta had no need for city walls, because its men were its walls. But internally, Sparta was surrounded by something far more dangerous than stone battlements could solve: fear. That fear shaped institutions. One of them was the agoge, the infamous state education system that began at age 7. Boys were removed from their families and trained collectively in discipline, endurance, obedience, and warfare. They learned to fight, to steal without being caught, to endure hunger and cold. They were taught that weakness was shameful. But for some, the training did not end with adolescence. For a select group, it entered a darker phase: the Crypteia. Our primary ancient source for this institution is Plutarch, writing centuries later in his life of Lycurgus. He describes the Crypteia as a kind of secret service composed of young Spartans sent into the countryside armed with daggers. They were instructed to kill helots deemed strong, rebellious, or potentially dangerous. Each year, according to these accounts, the Spartan ephors, the 5 powerful magistrates elected annually, would formally declare war on the helots. This ritual declaration meant that killing a helot would not incur religious pollution. Let that settle. A state ritualizing war against its own labor force, not during rebellion, not during open conflict, but as a preemptive mechanism. The ephors were no minor officials. They held immense authority. Even the dual kings of Sparta were subject to their oversight. A king like Leonidas, famed for his stand at Thermopylae, operated within a political structure that balanced royal power with institutional control. And that structure understood something fundamental: military dominance externally requires stability internally. The Crypteia functioned at that intersection. Some modern historians debate its scale. Was it a widespread terror campaign, or a limited elite survival test exaggerated by later writers? Young Spartans were dispatched alone into rural Laconia and Messenia. They had to survive without visible support. They hid during the day. They moved at night. They observed. They selected targets. And according to Plutarch, they killed those helots who appeared particularly strong or influential. This was not random slaughter. It was calculated destabilization. Imagine being a helot farmer in Messenia. You work land your ancestors once owned before Spartan conquest in the 8th or 7th century BCE. You produce food that feeds the men who conquered you. You know rebellion is possible. History had already seen helot uprisings, including major revolts after the devastating earthquake that struck. Sparta around 464 BCE, that earthquake nearly destroyed the city. And in the chaos, Helots seized the opportunity to revolt. The uprising required years of military effort to suppress. Sparta never forgot that lesson. Natural disaster revealed vulnerability, and vulnerability demanded a response. The Crypteia may have been that response institutionalized. A constant reminder. A message delivered not by armies in formation, but by shadows in silence. It also served another purpose: psychological transformation. A young Spartan operating alone in hostile territory learned something the Phalanx could not teach. The Phalanx depended on cohesion, shields overlapping, trust in the man beside you, collective strength. But the Crypteia demanded solitude, autonomy, cold decision-making without witnesses. It stripped away even the camaraderie of military brotherhood. And in doing so, it cultivated a different kind of resilience. Or perhaps a different kind of hardness. Spartan society valued austerity. Meals were taken in communal messes known as syssitia. Even kings ate alongside other citizens. On the surface, this appears egalitarian. But the equality applied only to Spartiates. Below them were the Perioiko, free but politically subordinate inhabitants of surrounding towns. And below them, the Helots. The entire Spartan system depended on maintaining these layers. And layers require enforcement. Sparta's decline in later centuries was not caused by battlefield defeat alone. It was demographic. Over time, the number of full Spartan citizens decreased dramatically. When Thebes, under leaders like Epaminondas, defeated Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, it shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. More devastating still, Thebes liberated Messenia. The Helots were freed. Sparta lost its labor base. Without Helot labor, the entire Spartan military model collapsed. The system that had relied on permanent tension could not survive once its foundation was removed. And that brings us back to the Crypteia. Was it cruelty? Was it statcraft? Was it myth amplified by later writers fascinated by Spartan extremity? It was likely all three in some measure, but symbolically, it reveals something profound. Sparta did not merely train warriors. It engineered control mechanisms at every level of society, from childhood separation in the agoge, to communal loyalty in the syssitia, to secret enforcement in the countryside. Every institution reinforced the same principle. The state comes first, always, even over conscience. When modern audiences admire Spartan discipline, they often picture the battlefield, the shield wall, the red cloaks, the defiance at Thermopylae, but discipline has a maintenance cost. And that cost is often invisible. The Crypteia existed in that invisible space, between order and terror, between security and suppression, between strength and fragility. Because here is the paradox. A society that must constantly terrorize its labor force to remain stable is not as secure as it appears. Sparta projected invincibility, but internally, it lived with permanent anxiety. Anxiety of numbers, anxiety of revolt, anxiety of losing control. The Crypteia was not a symbol of confidence. It was a symptom of fear. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth. The warriors of Sparta did not only fight external enemies, they were trained to police their own foundation, to move through olive groves under moonlight, to silence potential threats before they became real ones, to maintain a system that could not afford weakness. So when we strip away the cinematic myth, when we step beyond the bronze helmets and dramatic last stands, we find something more complex. A society brilliant in military organization, severe in discipline, but dependent on perpetual internal tension. The mountains of Taygetus still stand. The valley of the Eurotas still runs quiet. But the shadows that once moved there remind us of something timeless. Power maintained through fear must always remain vigilant, because the night never truly ends. And in ancient Sparta, the darkness had structure, it had purpose, it had a name: the Crypteia. If you want to keep exploring the hidden mechanisms behind history's greatest civilizations, not just the famous battles, but the systems that made them possible, make sure to subscribe. Here, we don't just retell legends. We step into the shadows behind them. Leave a comment below. Was the Cryptia a necessary strategy or institutionalized terror? And thank you for staying until the end. Because understanding the past requires courage.